I'm here. Am I audible to all?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Your spine should be erect, your eyes should be closed. Namaskar Mudra. ॐ भद्रं कर्णेभिः शृणुयाम देवाः भद्रं पश्येमाक्षभिर्यजत्राः स्थिरैरङ्गैस्तुष्टवागंसस्तनूभिः वशेम देवहितं यदायुः ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः नमस्कार
Thank you. So let's begin. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for the today's edition of Vimersh Talk by Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh. He'll be speaking on Indo-US relations, and I want to thank him from my heart for accepting our invitation to take us through this highly relevant and important relationship and how it is shaping. Ambassador Arun Singh is presently a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He's also a distinguished fellow at the VIF. He has served as India's ambassador to Israel, France, and the United States, and also in Indian missions in Moscow, Addis Ababa, Tokyo, as well as in permanent mission of India in New York. As the head of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and UN divisions of the MEA, he was involved for a long time in the formulation and implementation of India's policies related to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, including in the period following 9/11, which was, as you know, a very critical period. He is a visiting professor at Ashoka University and a distinguished non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US. He has taught courses both at American University and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He was a distinguished visiting professor at the Center for Advanced Studies of India at the University of Pennsylvania and also a distinguished fellow at Emory University. We are honored to have him today with us at the VIF. Friends, Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Washington and his meeting with President Biden has set the tone for bilateral relations. The two leaders also attended the first in-person Quad Leadership Summit. Biden administration has reiterated the US commitment to further deepening the India-US ties. As we could gauge from the TV coverage of Modi-Biden meeting, both leaders had excellent personal chemistry. This bodes well for the relationship. In addition, we had several high-level visits both ways since Joe Biden assumed the presidency. Over the last second decades, Indo-US relations have had their ups and downs, but the relationship has transformed from being a transactional and uncertain relationship to becoming a global, comprehensive strategic partnership suited for the 21st century. No one would have foreseen such a deep and thorough transformation of bilateral ties when the nuclear deal was first agreed upon in 2005. How did that happen? That itself is an interesting research question. But what is important is that there is a bipartisan consensus in the US on building strategic ties with India. Likewise, all governments in India in recent years have prioritized building strategic ties with the US. The changing international environment has a lot to do with the making of Indo-US strategic partnership. The US sees India as a partner in its global and regional agenda, and India sees US as a partner in economic and scientific development, as well as in its security calculus. The large Indian diaspora in the US has played its own role in strengthening the ties. Prime Minister Modi has also reached out to them seeking their cooperation in nation building. As the two largest democracies, India and US have a natural attraction for other democracies. This helps in building democratic partnerships, and Quad is an example. Such groupings may prove to be important trendsetters in the new order. Indo-US relations are also impacted by domestic priorities. As a former ambassador, Mr. Arun Singh has a unique insight into how the US decision-making system works and how it affects bilateral relationship. Yet the question will always remain, what is the future of Indo-US relations? Where are we headed? How sustainable is the partnership in the backdrop of rapidly shifting global and regional equations? What are the factors that we should be mindful of? We need to have a 360-degree view of our relations. Today, we look forward to an engaging talk and discussion. And I'll now request Ambassador Arun Singh to kindly take the floor. And maybe you could speak, Arun, for about 45 minutes or so, and then we can have some Q&A. Thank you very much. Over to Arun.
Thank you. Thank you, Arvind. And thank you for this opportunity. I think the India-US relationship has been analyzed in detail at various fora, why it has evolved, what have been the challenges. And I thought for our discussion today, one, I'd make it less in the nature of a talk and of course more in the nature of hope to stimulate discussion and engagement with the group that's here, but also focus on the future. That what should we expect from the relationship in the future rather than just analyzing how it evolved in the past. Now, looking at the future, two thoughts strike me. One, that we must seize the present opportunity. And I say that because, as you also mentioned, when you look across the board in the US, there is strong and growing support for the India relationship. You hear that in the administration. You hear that from members of Congress. You may have seen that some senators have just written a letter to the president asking for waiver of CATSA sanctions. In several of the hearings that have taken place recently in the US Congress, there have been repeated references to the need to build a strategic partnership with India. You hear that also in the business community, because they feel that in terms of the challenge that they have from China going ahead, a partnership with India, with the numbers, the human resources that India brings to the table, would be important from them, aside from, of course, the current and potential size of their opportunities in India. So across the board, you hear that this is a relationship that needs to be developed. The Trump administration, for example, had set up a National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence involving both former members of the government and the business sector. And in their report, again, there is a reference to building a strong technology partnership with India. And when the Americans, for example, talk of Techno-Democratic Alliance, again, there's a reference to India being an important part of that. So we must keep in mind that in terms of support that there is in the US. It has been growing over time, but today perhaps it is the most widespread in terms of how they want to build the India relationship. And later we will come to why that is happening. Now, even as we seize the opportunity, I think it is important that we keep expectations realistic. We should not expect that just by seizing the moment, all issues, problems will be solved, that we will have no difficulties with the US, that the US will always be at our corner of the table and supporting us. And the reasons for that are many. One, we have to recognize that although the US remains the leading global power, in economic terms, still in technology terms, although increasingly being challenged by China, by others, in military terms. But there are limits of US power. And the US itself, post the dissolution of the Soviet Union, went through a phase, and one can say till now, when they felt that there was no limit to US power. And it led to a lot of hubris in US decision making. The nature of their intervention in Iraq, and various other interventions that they did. Now there is a serious realization, including in the US, that there is a limit to their power. And Afghanistan has been a glaring example of that. As somebody has commented, that it took the US 20 years to replace the Taliban by the Taliban. General Milley, their current chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a congressional hearing, said that the US has faced strategic defeat in Afghanistan. And of course, they need to analyze the reasons for that. So they set for themselves objectives in Afghanistan, varying over time based on either their domestic compulsions or their unrealistic expectation of what they could achieve. First talking about decimating Al-Qaeda, then talking about nation building in Afghanistan, nation building in the wider West Asian region, what they attempted in Iraq. But eventually, they have realized, and we all need to recognize, that there are limits to US power, and therefore they cannot always deliver on what others may expect of them. And similarly, if you look at Pakistan, today there is increasing articulation in the United States that one of the main reasons why they failed in Afghanistan, aside from other reasons, was that because they could not deal adequately with the sanctuary that was available in Pakistan for the Taliban. And even at the peak of it, when they found Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad near a Pakistan military academy in 2011, when Pakistan was supporting elements of the Taliban that were killing US soldiers in Afghanistan, and the US was well aware of that, they could not proceed to generate pressure on Pakistan beyond a point, because they justified it by talking in terms of need for stability in Pakistan, the Pashtun question being an important dimension in Pakistan, so that if they put too much pressure on the Taliban, there could be a blowback in Pakistan, and also concern related to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. So I think these two, aside from other examples, clearly show that there is a limit to US power. And in the period ahead, that limit will reveal itself more and more as the US is going to be challenged increasingly by China and also by Russia, who are looking at protecting their own interests. In this framework, we have to also keep in mind, as we build the relationship with the US, which we must, and I will come to that, that the US takes decisions based on its perception of its own interests. And no country takes decisions in foreign policy to help another country. They take decisions based on what they see as their interest. And in the assessment of US interests, clearly US domestic political compulsions come into play. So the nature of response, for example, post 9/11, the way they went into Afghanistan was dictated also by US domestic compulsion. President Bush was under pressure to show a certain kind of response. And there could have been many other choices that they could have exercised, but this was the response they needed to satisfy their domestic opinion. But as the cost of war in Afghanistan escalated, including in terms of not just expenditure in terms of resources, but manpower lost and soldiers killed, that the domestic opinion gradually started consolidating towards US getting out of Afghanistan. And you could see that from the time of the Obama administration in 2009, start of that administration. So again, we have to understand that decisions that the US will take will be based on its own interest, based on its own political compulsions. And very often in the decisions that the US takes, it does not always consult its allies and partners in advance. That's the nature of the US system. They go through a very comprehensive interagency process usually. Of course, even that process had broken down under President Trump, who was taking largely a decision based on his own preferences. But usually, and you see that also in the Biden administration, it was there certainly in the Obama administration and the Bush administration, going through very comprehensive interagency reviews of situations before arriving at a decision. But once that decision was taken, they would normally present it to their allies and partners that this is where we are. And then they would expect that their allies and partners would line up behind them. Because ultimately their capacity to deliver on any issue was way beyond the capacity of any of the allies and partners. So that's again something that one has to keep in mind, that unless the US system changes dramatically, and of course Joe Biden has tried to signal that he would like to consult with allies and partners before the withdrawal that was carried out in Afghanistan, there was a very deliberate attempt to show that they were consulting their partners in NATO, and Secretary Blinken had gone there for a meeting, the Defense Secretary had gone there for a meeting. But even the Europeans, for example, were complaining that when Trump administration did the agreement with the Taliban in February 2020, they did not share details of the agreement or what they were doing with the European and NATO partners. And many of the NATO partners were actually present in Afghanistan when they were taking action against the Taliban. So again, that's an aspect that one has to keep in mind, the nature of decision-making processes in the US. And there is also the dynamic between the administration and Congress. Because very often the administration may want to do something, the Congress may not agree, and the administration has to work its way around that. So that, for example, if there's an Indian interest involved, we have to be aware that even if the administration is positively inclined, what is the dynamic in Congress? Will it work for us or not? If you take, for example, the CATSA sanctions that the US Congress took the initiative on, and President Trump eventually signed. President Trump was not keen to take negative action against Russia, but it was the US Congress that wanted to bind his hands because they felt that Russia may have, from their perspective, intervened in the 2016 election to help President Trump. So they wanted to tie down his hands, and so they brought in the CATSA legislation, which has tied down the hands of the administration. And I think the US administration today, when it is trying to examine how to deal with the CATSA legislation in the context of India, has to also try and see what will be the reaction in US Congress to the kind of decision that it may want to take. So that's again, and of course it gives us leverage also. I remember that in February 2016, for example, the Obama administration decided that at that stage they wanted to incentivize Pakistan to get more help in the context of Afghanistan. And they authorized sale of F-16 aircraft to Pakistan, which was completely not acceptable to us. And we were able to reach out to US Congress at that time and block the sale of F-16 aircraft to Pakistan. So again, that's a dynamic that one can use, but it's a dynamic that we have to be aware of. So given these aspects, I think when we are building the relationship with the US in the future, we have to be mindful of looking for convergences. We should not really expect that US will be taking decisions because they want to help us as such, but they will be taking the decision if it works in their interest. So we have to see where is the convergence in the India-US relationship. And once we are able to see the convergence, that will give us the basis to deepen the partnership with the US and see where the US can be helpful in terms of what India may need. For example, in terms of information that came out in the public domain last year, when we had the challenge with China in Ladakh, the US shared equipment with India, winter clothing and other things, and shared a lot of information and intelligence with India. So again, where there is US capacity, where there is US interest, of course, we can leverage it to our advantage. But this also means that as we build the relationship with the US, for stability in the relationship, as I said, we should be careful not to have unrealistic expectations. And we should be mindful of the fact that at times the US decisions, as they see taking in their interest, may not always coincide with what we see as our interest. But at the same time, this would imply that the US must similarly give space to India to take decisions on its own interests. And therefore, as this relationship is built up, the US should not expect that on any foreign policy issue, whatever decision the US takes India should be supportive of that decision, because India will again need to take decisions based on its own interests. And Russia is a clear example. Iran is another area where the interests do not fully coincide. So if the US wants to build stability in the relationship with India, wants to sustain political support in India for the consolidating US-India relationship, it is important that they also give space to India to be able to take decisions in its own interest, even if it is not in convergence with the decision that the US may want to take. And I think one area where it will come into sharp focus will be later this year when the US administration and Congress decide what to do with the CAPSA provisions as they apply to Russia. Because that provision requires that any major defense acquisition from Russia could, in terms of US law, be liable to sanctions unless the administration waives that sanction. And in the Congress, among some sections, there is a strong push based largely with the concern related to Russia, that if there is a major purchase from Russia, some sanctions should be considered. And you know that Turkey, which is a NATO ally of the US, has been sanctioned for buying of the S-400 from Russia. Now, in India's case, clearly everyone is aware of the nature of our relationship with Russia, earlier with the Soviet Union, the kind of political support we got at various times when we needed the strong defense partnership. And even today, a very large part of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. And therefore, taking decisions based in our own interest and taking decisions mindful of our policy of maintaining strategic autonomy. Clearly, we will be doing the purchases based on what we feel are important for us, not because another country wants to influence any particular decision. So here, if the US administration goes ahead and sanctions India, even if minimally, because my own assessment would be that they would probably not want to sanction India, because they are aware that the moment the US sanctions India in any way, it will be seen in India as an unreliable partner. It will go completely against the grain of the gradually consolidating the US-India relationship. It will go against the kind of partnership, for example, they are building in the context of the Quad. But we have to see how their political compulsions and other aspects play out. But if they were to sanction India in any way, they will be seen as an unreliable partner. And in reality, although the form may be of sanctioning India, they will not be sanctioning India. They will be sanctioning the US-India relationship. And they will be sanctioning US itself, because perception related to the US in India will take a major hit. So we have to see how this particular dimension plays out in terms of US domestic politics and the ability of the administration to handle US Congress. Now, this was a scenario that I wanted to build for us to keep expectations on a realistic level and mindful of the challenges. But that having been said, clearly, there is in the period ahead going to be huge opportunity and convergence of interest for building the US-India partnership. I think globally it is being said, and I think in the US, one hears it repeatedly in the administration, Congress, in the policy community, that global relations are at an inflection point today. That the unipolar phase that started in 1990 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union has today ended. We are now entering a phase of major power rivalry at the peak between US, Russia, and China. In this phase, the US has described China as its main economic, technological, and military challenge in a comprehensive way. Russia, they see as the main military challenge, and China as the main economic and technological challenge. In the framework of the challenge that they see vis-a-vis China, in terms of their own interests, they see India as a very important partner. Because if they are to meet the technology challenge from China, given the size of the Chinese market, given just the number of people there in terms of human resources who are engaged in technology, the US sees that the partnership with India will be very important for them in terms of the technology talent. In fact, in my conversations with US companies, both when I was in the US and when I've been here, it is clear that many of them employ a large number of people doing R&D and development work in India, because they believe that certain kind of niche technology work happens in India, which is cost effective in terms of technology that they can take from here to Africa, Latin America, certain parts of the US. Many of the leading companies do cutting edge design and technology work in India. Of course, the intellectual property rests with the American company, but the work is being done in India, including, for example, in jet engines. So they see that the partnership with India is important for them to meet this challenge. You would have seen the recent comment of the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, about the launch of what has been described as the Chinese hypersonic missile, which circled the globe and then went in back into the earth as a Sputnik moment for them in terms of the challenge that China's technology poses. Now, the US policy on China has evolved over time. Since they reached out to China in 1971, the thrust of the policy was to work for integration of China into the international mainstream. And the prevailing argument was that by integrating China into the international mainstream, it will lead to political and economic liberalization in China. Today, it is increasingly being said in the US that that policy has been a failure. It did not work. The Obama administration in 2009 had initially spoken of reassurance to China that they would accommodate China's legitimate interests as it rose as a major power. But then they shifted to a pivot or rebalance to Asia, recognizing the challenge that China poses to them. In 2015, when China went ahead and militarized the islands in South China Sea, at that stage, US again did not take any action beyond asserting freedom of navigation, which is being increasingly questioned as China sort of consolidates its military presence in those islands. But so at the time of the Trump administration, the US came out with a clear articulation that they see China as a strategic rival and will devise many of their strategies, domestic and international, to deal with that challenge. And so in that framework, there was an emphasis then on the Indo-Pacific, because before that, the US spoke of Asia Pacific and of course the Indian Ocean, but now they started talking of the Indo-Pacific, a signal that they saw India very much as an important partner in terms of the challenge they see in the region. The Quad, which had been languishing for a long time, was revived and started meeting at the level of officials. And then when the Biden administration came in, they took it further by first doing a virtual summit in March and then an in-person summit in September. And through the Quad, they're trying to signal that membership in Quad is useful for the members themselves and the kind of technology access they can get in the US and technology partnerships they can build, but also through membership of Quad, they can contribute to the wider good in the Asia Pacific region. And so some of the decisions that have been taken, for instance, in terms of climate action, climate technology, climate financing through the Quad, and the decision on vaccines, where 1.2 billion COVID vaccines would be provided in the region. Technology coming from the US, financing from US and Japan, production in India, and logistics also facilitated by Australia. Now, going beyond that, there is increasing talk, and has been for some time in the US, about reshoring of supply chains. Because in the post 1990 phase, the talk in the US was of globalization of production, and that go for efficiency in production, reducing costs, even if it led to concentration of production in certain areas. And China was a huge beneficiary of that process. But with the disruption caused by COVID, with the challenge from China, there is there has been increasing talk now for some years, not just of onshoring in the US, but reshoring of the global supply chain so that it moves away from China also to other countries. And in terms of this reshoring of supply chains, we also hear talk of trusted, secure supply chains. And in talking of trusted and secure supply chains, India is certainly being seen as an important partner in the period ahead. While this conversation on reshoring of supply chains is going on, there is a new focus on critical and emerging technologies. So, for example, if you look at the messages, statements that came out during Prime Minister's recent visit to the US, both from the bilateral meetings as well as the Quad meetings, repeated references to technology, partnership in technology, repeated references to critical and emerging technologies. And I think it is recognized that across the whole spectrum, but also in the new and emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum, 5G, 6G, cyber, biotech, space, where there's now a lot of activity in the private sector, all these are going to transform the way we live, the way we work. They will influence technology leadership in the coming period. They will also influence security capacities in the growing period. And here, the US, not just the administration, but also business, is mindful of the advantage in partnership with India, where India has certain strengths. And of course, for India, also this partnership is useful if we can build some understanding on work share, some ability to generate intellectual property in India, because otherwise, as of now, a certain amount of core technology development, of course, is happening in the US, but application of technology is happening in India. Now, going ahead from here, I think one of the areas that we would need to watch would be Afghanistan. Because the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. It is working out its subsequent approach to Afghanistan. As of now, aside from the immediate political concern of trying to show that it is responding to the humanitarian situation, or that it is working to take out American nationals and others who may have worked with America, who may be stuck in Afghanistan and is aware and is responsive to their concern, is working to take them out. The main focus of the US would be on the potential terrorism threat from Afghanistan as it may impact on them. And there, what I hear and read in terms of what's coming out in the US is one that they believe that they have built substantial homeland security capacity in the US to prevent major ingress from outside to carry out terrorist attacks in the US. Although, inspired attacks of a certain kind could certainly take place. They also believe that while there could be potential terrorism-related challenges from the US, from Afghanistan, Pakistan for US, that's not the only area for where there's a potential terrorism challenge. They see that challenge coming from Somalia, from Yemen, from Syria, from Sahel. So Afghanistan, Pakistan area becomes one out of the five, one out of the six areas from which there is a potential terrorism threat to the United States. Therefore, the salience of this region for the US in terms of dealing with the terrorism challenge will certainly go down compared to the situation that is there today. And then we'll need to watch that if this region remains a source of major terrorism challenge for India, with the changes that have happened, with the capacity that ISI has shown of late, including in terms of linkages that it has with elements in the Taliban and others, then what would be the kind of support that India may have from the US in dealing with this challenge? I mean, that's a question mark that would need to be addressed in the future. Also, as the US focus on the area comes down, and even for its own domestic political purposes, US administration would like that the focus on Afghanistan come down for a while, because otherwise the Biden administration would be criticized for the withdrawal, for a flawed withdrawal, which could impact on the 2022 congressional and 2024 presidential elections. So even as they try to work to reduce the salience or visibility of Afghanistan as an issue in US politics, what is the support that they get from Pakistan in terms of counterterrorism cooperation? Because Pakistan would like to project to them that even as your presence is limited, we are ready to provide you some support on counterterrorism cooperation, information, intelligence. You'd have seen reports that although Pakistan has not given US permission to have a physical presence, they have allowed overflights for US aircraft and drones to go into Afghanistan to do ISR activity. And a recent congressional Senate hearing, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Kahl, said that the support and cooperation they were getting from Pakistan on counterterrorism at the moment was very good. So given this situation, how does US policy in this particular area aspect evolve over time is something that we will need to watch, and of course it will impact on us. But we should also be mindful of the fact that the bilateral relationship with the US is strong, it's robust, and that should provide a ballast to the relationship as it deals not just with opportunities but also challenges. Our trade now stands at about $150 billion. It has increased 7 times in the last 20 years. The balance is in India's favor, which again is very good from our point of view, because overall we are a trade deficit country. US has invested almost $30 billion in India in different industries. Indian companies have invested more than $20 billion in the US in IT, pharmaceutical, and other sectors, automobile, auto components, because they find their presence in the US very useful in terms of access to technology, access to the market. The defense cooperation has increased tremendously. You know, in 2008, you referred to the India-US Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which was initiated in 2005, finally signed in October 2008. At that time, we were hardly doing any defense purchases from the US. By now, we have contracted to buy almost $20 billion of defense supplies from the US. And many of the things we have got from the US have been very useful to us. C-17, C-130 long-haul aircraft, helicopters, maritime reconnaissance aircraft. And they've been very useful when we evacuated people from Yemen, from other areas, or when we moved supplies into Ladakh last year. So this defense cooperation with the US has expanded. The US now does more military exercises with India than with any country outside NATO. If you look at the range of military exercises we do with the US, Army exercises, Navy, Air Force, Special Forces, tri-service exercises, multilateral exercises, including the Malabar series with Japan, and also now Australia been there in the last 2 rounds. And the 2 countries are now also looking at a defense technology partnership. Although in that area so far we have not as yet seen any major progress, but during the recent visit of the Prime Minister, in the joint statement, there's a reference to the 2 countries agreeing to work together for development of technology for air-launched unmanned aerial vehicles. But that's an area where more certainly needs to be done. But also, Indian companies are gradually becoming a part of the global supply chain of US defense manufacturers. So many of the major US defense manufacturers are beginning to do sourcing in India for their global supplies and not just for their supplies in India. The Indian origin diaspora at more than 4 million again provides a very important dimension to the partnership. From the figures that I had seen earlier, there are more than 120,000 Indian origin doctors in the US. 1 out of 7 patients are seen by an Indian origin doctor. 40% of all hotel rooms in the US are owned and managed by Indian Americans, generating almost $15 billion of revenue, huge contribution to income tax, social security contributions. And the members of the Indian origin diaspora, who earlier were focused more on economic opportunity, are now becoming a very important part of the administration and the political system. Till about 2014, historically, only 3 Indian Americans were in Congress. Now there are 5 in Congress simultaneously through repeated election cycles since 2016. We now have a vice president there who's of Indian origin, and the leader of the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party in the House, of 100 members out of a total strength of 220, is an Indian origin congresswoman. So they are becoming active, influential in politics, administration, which has its challenges, but also has opportunities. And then we have 200,000 Indian origin students. And these are not Indian students, not whose parents are in the US. Students who've gone, whose parents are in India, in US universities. And on them, we are spending almost $5 to $6 billion a year just as tuition fees. So while that is an outflow, through their presence in the US, they're also able to build networks, build understanding of the US system. And in their subsequent phase, many of them have built economic relationships between India and the US. And it certainly adds to the partnership. So there is a growing pool of stakeholders in the US who are invested in India and the India relationship. And a very concrete example we found was in April, May this year, when we went through a major COVID-related challenge in India. And in the beginning, the administration was very slow in its response because it was a new administration. They're trying to figure out what they needed for themselves, what they could do in terms of support to other countries. And there was a blowback in the US system. Several congressmen, senators asked the administration to be more responsive. The Indian origin community stepped forward to demand better response from the administration. US businesses demanded better response from the administration. And eventually, the administration organized itself for a very robust response and contributed almost $400 million worth of supplies at that time. So it shows that there is, not just in the administration, but in the wider community in the US, a growing realization of the value to the US of the India partnership. Again, which is something that will be useful as we navigate the challenges in the period ahead. And I think another aspect that we will have to keep in mind is that US is going to see tremendous changes in its policy choices. Post dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the US saw itself as an unchallenged only power in the world, the the tendency was to use the military option in any situation they saw. They thought, they had won. The US system was the right kind of system for the world. That was the way other societies must organize themselves. So there was a proclivity to try and intervene in other situations and very often use military power for that purpose because they thought they could prevail. And we saw that in Yugoslavia, we saw that in Serbia, and then, of course, later, 2003, in Iraq. Today, the US system seems to have absorbed that option doesn't exist anymore. that the military option to reorder other societies hasn't worked, and what has happened in Afghanistan only recently has only reinforced that, and that there are others who now are in a position also to challenge the US. Now, as there was a growing realization that the military option was not working, the US resorted to the use of economic sanctions to achieve its objectives. Because the US was the leading global economic power. All countries, most major companies were heavily invested in linkages with the US. And by threatening economic sanctions and economic coercion, US was able to influence the choices that other countries exercise. And I think they are now coming gradually to the realization that even that option is running out, because China is now providing an alternative ecosystem for engagement. The Chinese GDP is it's $14 trillion. It has invested heavily in many countries in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, and China and Russia may not necessarily go along with the economic sanctions and coercion that the US may try and impose. So while this may still continue for a while, I think there is a growing recognition in the US that the use of economic sanctions as an easy option is also going to wither away. So now we are entering a phase of major power rivalry in the global context. And again, somewhat different from the bipolar world pre 1990, where aside from others, you have US, Russia, China. So, what are the norms and policies and instruments that the US is going to bring into play to deal with this new situation that is still in evolution? And we'll have to watch that and carefully work our way around it so that our interests are preserved. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to quote from the statement that the MEA had issued on September 24 after the meeting between Prime Minister and President Biden. And it said that the Prime Minister said that India and USA were entering a decade of transformation based on the pillars of tradition of democratic values, technology, trade, talent of our people, trusteeship of nature, and above all, a trust. And the joint statement that was issued on the occasion was titled A Partnership for Global Good. So let me stop here. And my aim was to lay out for us the opportunities that are there, the context that is there, and of course the challenges that there will be in the period ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun, for that wonderful overview of Indo-US relations. And I think coming from you, who has worked there for a long time and also who understands the system, I think it was very interesting for us to understand the framework in which we should be looking at India-US relations. And I think 2 or 3 key points that you highlighted. Of course, you said many things, but for me, 2, 3 key things that you highlighted, which Indian policymakers and analysts should keep in mind, are one is that the limitations to US power and US ability to deliver. So while there would be convergences and there would be a lot of movement in Indo-US relations in various areas, but whether the US would be able to help India when it really requires, I think that's one question that we should continuously be asking ourselves, because dependence on one power and that may not be a very good thing for us. And that is why I think now, as the Afghanistan situation has also indicated, the US is moving away, whereas the problems for India in the region are growing. And we may have to deal with them in our own way. And that is why we find that there is now a greater engagement India has with Central Asia, with Iran, with Russia, etc. So in this great power rivalry which is returning, and which is we don't know what shape it will really take. While India-US relationship will remain important, but it will also impact our other relationships, and we'll have to, as you said, find our way, carefully through this period of transition. The second point, I think, which is very important, because we are also entering into a phase, maybe which will last for another 20, 30, 40 years, that of nation building and emergence of India. Technology becomes very important, economy becomes very important, and of course, our relationships in the neighborhood, they are also very important. So to what extent we can leverage the US in this new Bharat which is emerging? And I think we ought to be clear about our own objectives and carefully, pass through all our relationships, including with the US. So I think that's the second point. And the third point, I think, which is more specific, is really which comes, if if we have one, say, problems with China, and problems with China can take, as we have seen, they can they have a very strong military component. Galwan showed that, and the Chinese naval buildup, etc., that is taking place. So we are really facing a challenge from China, which is both continental, which is also maritime, which is also, I think, on the economic side as well. Now, in this very complex situation, to what extent we can count on the US is, I think, one issue that we'll have to think through. So I think it's very useful, the framework, as well as a lot of information that you gave about the bilateral relationship. So I'll now, I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and I'll open it up for Q&A and brief comments if people have. Let me see whether there are any, and there's something in the chat box. Is just
Master Satish Chandra.
okay. I can't see. Ambassador Satish Chandra. Maybe you could start with Ambassador Satish Chandra.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Thank you, Arvind.